1974's The Mutations, also known as Freakmaker, is a US-UK co-production sci-fi horror movie that cuts its cloth from that specific period of horror in the mid-70s that gave rise to such movies as Theatre of Blood, Blood on Satan's Claw and The Witchfinder General. If you've seen any of these films, you'll know the specific tone I'm talking about. It's gothic horror with its tongue firmly in its cheek. That's not to say it's a laugh-a-minute gurn fest. There's genuine horror here, just that these type of films in some aspects don't take themselves very seriously, but then contrast those more tonally camp moments with really quite grim scenes of horror. It's quite tonally jarring, and that's what makes these films as interesting as they are. The mixture of what the fuckery contrasting with dark macabre horror acts almost as a constant palate cleanser so that you'd never really totally get used to the way a film feels. And because of that, it makes every witty throwdown and every live electrocution that bit more punchy. It's really not a subgenre for everyone, but I adore these movies. And from 1971 till about 1977, dozens of these kinds of movies were produced. And their vibe is just so unique that odds are if you've seen any of these films and liked them, you'll probably find joy in all of them. The Mutations is no different in that regard, and while in some ways I can't say it's the most original idea in the world, it's certainly the one that had me sat firmly mesmerised throughout. So, the film doesn't really have a main character, rather there are main characters who all work together to keep the film rumbling on at a reasonable pace. It's difficult really to think of where to begin explaining this one, just purely because in talking about one particular character's narrative, I'm going to be quite prone to omitting other characters' plot points. So I'll try my best, but apologies if this does come across as a bit jumbled. The film is mainly centred around the experiments and works of Professor Noller, played by Donald Pleasence. He's obsessed with plant life, and in particular its ability to mutate and evolve to better adapt to its surroundings. He's also a little bit nutty, but in a wonderfully subdued way that also adds a strange air of menace to him. He believes that if you can somehow trigger the human body to allow mutations and then instill plant genetics into a human, he can create a human-plant hybrid that's much more resilient and better adapted to live on Earth than humans. He argues it would create a species that's much more capable of adapting to rapidly changing environments, that could effectively live off photosynthesis, for the most part. This would cut down drastically on food consumption, but with the human element for survival and robustness, it would make them a much stronger and better suited candidate. But Professor needs willing volunteers for his experiments, and unfortunately no one really wants to be a plant person. So he enlists the help of Lynch, played by Tom Baker. Lynch is the co-partner of a travelling freak show with the show's ringmaster, Mr. Burns. No, not that one. Lynch suffers from a glandular issue that's caused multiple growths to appear on his face. He's disgusted by himself and is deeply embarrassed about how other people see him, particularly, quote, normal people. This has led to him lashing out at his co-partners and fellow freak show cast. The professor makes a deal with Lynch. If he can provide him with a few unwilling volunteers to experiment on when the professor has finally figured out what needs to be done to create his human plant people, he'll use his knowledge to reverse engineer a mutation to cure Lynch of his glandular problem. The main problem is that a lot of these experiments haven't ended well. In fact, they've ended quite horrifically. But the professor's trying harder and harder and is getting closer and closer to his ultimate end goal. That is until a group of the professor's students begin to get a bit more involved in the professor's life. Heidi, Tony, Lauren and Bridget initially agree to help the professor by meeting an American scientist called Brian Redford who's visiting the UK in order to meet the professor and talk about his bio-experiments. Unfortunately, the day before they're set to meet Redford, Bridget's abducted by Lynch after being chased through a park by Burns. Her disappearance sits heavily on the group for a while, but they don't really pay it much heed. That is until one night, while trying to put Bridget out of their minds, they decide to head to a circus which is in town this week. The same circus that hosts the freak show run by Burns and Lynch. And they've just got a new attraction, the Lizard Woman of Tibet. The gang go for the main freak show but leave without seeing the lizard woman. Tony, who's a massive skeptic throughout the film about the benefits of mutation and of the professor's mental state, becomes very curious about the lizard woman, however. He can't leave the idea alone. So one night after the circus has closed, he sneaks out to try and catch a glimpse, only to bump into Lynch, who hunts him down and takes him to the professor for experimentation. From here, the film spirals into a weird and wonderful creature feature, in which Lynch begins to become more and more abusive to his fellow freak colleagues, and the gang begin to grow worried as their numbers begin to dwindle. In a fiery finale that would give some Hammer films a run for their money, the question is, will the Doctor succeed in his plans, or will the gang be able to stop the worst elements of the mutations? This is a film of peaks and troughs, and I'm going to sound a bit oxymoronic as I review this because the film's biggest problem is also its most entertaining element. You see, this movie's script is a bit like a Godfrey Ho movie. It feels like it's taken two completely different films and edited them together to make one slightly jumbled but ultimately enjoyable picture. Film A is your creature feature film with the mad professor, the inquisitive gang of young adults trying to figure out what's going on, and the aforementioned carnage that the creature of this feature creates. It's great fun, if not a little bit slow at times. Film B, however, is basically Todd Browning's 1932 heavily underrated cult classic Freaks. And it's painfully obvious that the writers and director of this film had seen Freaks, or at minimum had heard of it, because this film lifts about 70% of the themes and plot lines from Freaks into this B-movie. The plot here is following the members of the freak show within the circus as they try to hold together their close-knit family while Lynch bulldozes through any goodwill that's attempted. The other freaks hate Lynch with a passion, but Burns holds them in place with the promise that he won't be around forever and the hope that one day he may accept who he is and become a member of the family. The members of the freak show begrudgingly tolerate him till then. They all seem fairly mild-mannered people who are very polite but clearly suffer from knowing that they are different from the general population and that the public at best would struggle to accept them and at worst would be horrifically cruel to them. And as the tensions build, their general upset about the situation is ultimately vented on Lynch in the third act. A scene that's pretty much solidly lifted from the end of Freaks is essentially played out. The branching link between film A and B is Lynch. He's the mad scientist's henchman in film A, and he's the main antagonist and much hated figure in film B. Why the film is so tonally strange and thinly linked is a bit beyond me. Apart from Lynch, neither of these films' plotlines have any interaction with each other, really. You could probably edit this film in such a way that removes almost all of either film A or B, and it would make a completely different yet still coherent narrative. It's a bit weird like that, and because there is a separation between the two plots, it means that from a script and narrative perspective, you'd never really feel fully settled into this one. The elements are good, but put together it makes a bit of a tonally disjointed picture in all honesty. It's never overbearing, but it is noticeable. Much like the script, the direction's a bit of a game of two halves as well. Direction of the cast is a drab affair. There are multiple scenes that could be best described as actor stands in front of the camera, monologues, walks about a little bit, and then exits scene. There are times when these scenes almost seem completely emotionless, and the lack of movement of the cast or guidance within the direction makes it very static to watch at times. So that's a real shame. However, the direction from a cine perspective is generally pretty good. In particular, the abduction of Bridget in the beginning of the film has some solid direction about it. This film was shot in autumn in the UK, and they really go to great lengths to make sure that those seasonal colours and scenery are put to most excellent use. The lab shots are, for the most part, clinical and creepy with an unsettling wooziness about them that works really well, and it really helps to set the tone. While possibly not a directional choice, I also have to mention here that the colours used throughout are particularly engaging too. Greens and reds seem to be the flavour of the day here, which I guess makes reasonable sense given that this is a plant-based horror movie. This film was directed by Jack Chriddof. Jack's predominantly a cinematographer rather than a director, which I suppose explains why this film looks as good as it does, and The Mutations was his last directed feature. After this he would predominantly be based in cine. As a director, his biggest film was probably this or Sons and Lovers. As a cinematographer, Jesus, this guy was part of the Silver Age of cinema. A thin sample of his showreel would include movies such as A Matter of Life and Death, Black Narcissus and War and Peace, and that's just 3 of his better-known pieces. The list goes on and is predominantly made up of big-budget, very well-received Hollywood hits. It's astounding, really, that this movie is on his CV given where he's come from. Seriously, he's properly impressive. I don't think I can really go much further without talking about the practical effects, which honestly were a bit of a sliding scale. On the plus side of things, the prosthetics used with Lynch are pretty impressive in some scenes. It's clear, however, that they had an indoor and outdoor set of prosthetics, and the indoor ones look significantly better than the outdoor ones. The Lizard Woman effect is pretty striking too, though I imagine it wouldn't stand up to much scrutiny beyond the scene it's in. It's very much a blink and you'll miss it moment, and it's used quite effectively. The worst of the worst is probably the plant person that features from around the second act through to the end. It's a transformatory effect that evolves as the film progresses, and basically it starts off just looking clunky, awkward and laughably lopsided, and by the end of the movie you're looking at a crinoid basically, which, while fitting given Tom Baker's involvement, is not a compliment. That being said, these cheesy and slightly ropey practical effects do help in further lending an Atom Age Monster Madness vibe about this picture. So I suppose depending on what you're looking for in the film, this may end up ultimately working for you. Performance-wise, it's not bad. Donald Pleasence and Tom Baker are both excellent as the Professor and Lynch respectively. It's nice to see Pleasence tackle the role of mad scientist, something he plays wonderfully muted and weirdly European. It's an unusual performance, but one that just won't leave my mind. Baker, meanwhile, is irascible, nihilistic and desperate as Lynch, and genuinely feels deranged at times. He's utterly watchable, and it's no wonder that after this film he ended up landing the role as the much-loved Time Lord. The supporting cast are okay, they fill out the roles they're destined for quite nicely, but ultimately they aren't majorly memorable. And at times they can be a bit too British pessimistic. I suppose you have to be British to understand what I mean by that, but sometimes being the typical "core blimey things are a bit crap, Little Englander" stereotype can become quite grating. I also can't talk about this film without mentioning some of the weird and unusual scenes that take place. There are moments that really seem a bit over the top for a rather muted 70s creature feature. There's a very British amount of nudity in this film. Lots of boobies, but it's forced in an almost embarrassingly set way against the other plot elements. And it dances around sex very coyishly. There's a scene where Lynch visits a prostitute, and it's just awkward and, well, weird, especially given that the film has a very distinct tone that in no way invokes this. For it to suddenly veer into sex and nudity really breaks the clinical and harsher tones of the film. But there are other moments that are just odd, like the bit where the protagonist goes to the circus and ends up seeing the freak show. The film didn't need to show us the freak show. It could have quite easily just shown us a couple of acts maybe. But no, instead we have what feels like 10 minutes of the film entirely dedicated to just recreating an old-timey freak show, in which the stars come out on stage, do their act, talk to the audience for a little bit and then sit and chill. It's really quite odd and very uncomfortable watching in the 21st century, in all honesty. But who's responsible for this weird and wonderful throwback? Well, the script was written by Edward Mann and Robert D. Weinbach. Edward wrote 9 films during his career, and there's nothing that honestly majorly stood out to me. Robert, by contrast, wrote 3 films and produced 6. Again, though, nothing that particularly stood out to me. It's surprising, really, because while the script isn't the sharpest in the world, it's better than quite a few films I've seen. So to see that these 2 writers wrote so little and didn't really do anything else of note did catch me off guard, honestly. Finally, the soundtrack, which for the early 1970s was the most and least surprising thing about this film. It's all experimental sci-fi synth pieces, but there's some clear experimentation in the mix. I can't say it's memorable, but it definitely stuck out as being odd for this type of film. Typically these kind of movies have quite a grand sounding orchestral score, so to effectively hear early 70s synth prog underscoring this film was just weird. It didn't feel right. It reminds me heavily of when film companies rescored old 1920s silent films with 80s and 90s prog rock synth chords. This is quite similar, only the recordings are of the time, so it just feels a bit alien. It's all good stuff, but it's just, well, odd. The Mutations was released on VHS in 1989 as part of RCA's Hollywood Horror Collection. As far as I can tell, it's never had a UK DVD or Blu-ray release, but it has had at least 2 or 3 European DVD releases. They're Region 2, so they should play on UK players. But if you look for the Mutations DVD or the Freakmaker DVD, I'm sure you'll find something that'll play in your region. Though I would love to see this get a proper Blu-ray release, especially considering the kind of films that are getting Blu-ray releases these days. I'm very surprised that this one hasn't had something by now. Ultimately, while this film does have some flaws, I found it to be pretty fun and something of a forgotten gem. With some great performances, an interesting soundtrack and some more than reasonable cine, I'm genuinely shocked that this hasn't seen a UK release beyond this VHS tape. It's definitely a prime candidate for the Arrow treatment, if not a definite for Severin films. While I will concede that the plot is far from original and similarities to Browning's Freaks is undeniable, if you're going to rip off another film, at least make your source material great. If you can find a copy of this, and you like those early mid-70s British horror films like Blood on Satan's Claw or The Witchfinder General or The Wicker Man, this has some very similar tones, and I'd say give it a go.